Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kumi Now. My name is Sarah, and I am your host today, joining you from the traditional territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute Indigenous peoples in the modern state of Wyoming. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering, as we learn how the struggles for Palestinian rights, specifically those of the Bedouin community, connect to Indigenous struggles for rights around the world. This theme is in relation to yesterday's celebration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcast live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links in the chat so that others may join us yet today. Also, we're now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your community or are otherwise advocating for Palestine. So if you'd have an idea or a project that you'd like to share with the rest of the group for up to about 5 minutes of sharing in a future meeting, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. We're going to start with our weekly activism survey. So we'll launch a poll. Note that there are 3 questions, so you'll need to scroll down in order to answer all 3. First question's asking, what actions did you take related to the last topic about collective punishment? And the second question, the UN's rubric for identifying an Indigenous people includes which of the following? Choose one. Self-identification as Indigenous peoples, strong links to territory and surrounding natural resources, a resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environment, or all of the above. And the last question is a question of your opinion. Which of the following aspects of the Israeli occupation most resemble the experience of Indigenous peoples in your own country? All right, so has everyone had a chance to answer the poll? So the answer to number 2 is the last answer, all of the above. And the UN criteria also includes that they form non-dominant groups of society, have a distinct language, culture, and beliefs, have a historic continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies, and distinct social, economic, or political systems. And of course, the answer to number 3 is your own opinion, which it looks like the majority thought of land seizures, but also definitely some strong seeing of the denial of Indigenous history and erasure of culture. And if you see any other similarities, please feel free to put those in the chat. So we hope that you will find this session interesting and informative. And I'd like to start by having everyone who will be speaking today introduce themselves. So first Omar and then Angela, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. Shouting with a muted phone does not help. My name is Omar Harami. I am from Sabil. I will be sharing with you a news update from Palestine and Israel. It's a pleasure to be with you again this week. Thank you, Sarah.
And my name is Angela Godfrey Goldstein. I know some of you, and it's wonderful to see familiar faces when we can't easily travel or get together as groups and so forth. I co-direct a Palestinian nonprofit called Jahlin Solidarity, and I've been involved in Bedouin issues, Indigenous issues, since about 1996. I had a very remarkable teacher who was Bedouin, and that was a relationship that lasted 20 years until he died 6 years ago. And he followed on much of the teaching that brought me to Israel. So some of you who know me know that there's something a bit weird going on in the background. And that original teacher was or is Yemenite, who have a lot in common with Bedouin because it's about mountains and sea and desert and very deep spiritual beliefs. So I would say that Al-Khan Al-Ahmar has very much been a campaign that I've been waging since about 2005. Also the Bustan, where today there was a major demolition, so we're all very discombobulated by that. After all of the political work and all of the advocacy, the response to the presence today of the head of the CIA here in Jerusalem is a major house demolition. And those of you who are campaigners will share with me that grief on behalf of the family who lost a huge house. I will be talking in a moment very much about Indigenous rights and trying to link it in with liberation theology, which is maybe too ambitious, and we'll see how we go.
Thank you very much, Angela. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And Omar, could you please give us an update on realities on the ground, what is going on in Palestine this week?
Thank you, Sarah. So again, this part of the world continues to be very busy with important developments. Today was the highest recorded cases since February of COVID cases, over 6,000 cases with over 400 people seriously ill from COVID disease. Israel has been the leading country in the world with vaccination. However, and everybody was hopeful that with vaccinations, this nightmare would be over. Unfortunately, things we're going back to base one. Israel today also issued regulations that all countries from the world, except of 10, need to go into quarantine. Visitors from all countries apart of 10 need to go into quarantine, which is telling us that tourism and pilgrimage to the Holy Land, an important sector for our community, is going to be delayed even further. So people are worried, and uncertainty continues to grow. The Palestinian Minister of Education is planning the new school year will start next week, and it seems that life will go back to its normal. Palestine is recording less serious cases of COVID-19, and life is going back. Nobody really has a better understanding of what's happening. So we're very worried as parents, and the whole country is worried because its schools are going back, and this might even spike the number of cases again. The person who is in the white t-shirt, his name is Murad Atiyeh. He's one of the very active people in Sheikh Jarrah. He's the one who's always welcoming people and helping in the organization. He was arrested today by the Israeli army police. So please continue to remember that there is lots of tension in Sheikh Jarrah, and hold the families in your prayers. The person who is in the red t-shirt, his name is Imad Ali. He's 38 years old. He has a group picture with his kids, with his daughters. He was shot dead 2 days ago in Beta. Beta is the famous village that the whole community has been struggling and fighting the settlement expansion in their village. Israel has dismantled the settlement there, but yet there continues to be Israeli and settler presence on the mountain. So the community continues to go out every day and every night on the mountain to demonstrate. He was shot in the chest and passed away two hours later in a Nablus hospital. As Angela mentioned, Silwan, the village close to, or Silwan neighborhood, very close to the old city of Jerusalem, had witnessed two house demolitions today and yesterday. And there, however, it is the policy of divide and conquer. Israel also yesterday issued that they will delay the demolition of 6 houses or buildings for 6 months. So they have a new tactic. There's hundreds of houses under demolition threat in Jerusalem. They delay, they demolish, they take people into court. So it's a whole big mess in Jerusalem. However, the reality is that every day, almost every day, there is a demolition. This is the update from this week. Please, if you're not part of the Sabil Wave of Prayer, subscribe and use it also as an update for information. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, for helping us know what is going on and knowing what we can do. We'll turn now to our main issue of the week and our special guest. As Angela speaks, if you think of a question, please just type it in the chat. And then in the Q&A, the question and answer, I will ask them to Angela during that time. So Angela, please go ahead.
You can hear me okay, I hope. So, Indigenous culture is, for me, after 25 years or more, fascinating. And I would say that it's something that all of us can learn hugely from. It came as a great shock to me in the early days of seeing how much further ahead than we in the so-called civilized world, people who are semi-nomadic are, because they are everything we're not in a certain way. They are custodians of the planet. They know how to look after nature. They know how to be sustainable. They are proudly independent, but nevertheless, as a community, interdependent. So for Bedouin, in my experience, and obviously there are different tribes and different ways of being, the main principle, the main virtue, value is freedom. And that's why the relationship with liberation theology comes into view and is so interesting. Obviously, you have Bedouin inside Israel who are not free. They are not full citizens. If I tell you that no Bedouin citizen of Israel can legally be a farmer, they are not allowed to be pastoral herders. And obviously those who are in the West Bank as refugees, they're not landowners, and nor can they take animals out in a biblical landscape and do what is best for the environment and is totally sustainable. So I think I'm very blessed at having had so much exposure to traditional Bedouin living in the mountains in Sinai in Egypt, where I was an environmental activist for 4 years, having fallen in love with desert and with Bedouin culture, and obviously with one specific Bedouin as well, who used to talk about how the world is going backwards. So I think that those of us in the so-called developed world, in the global north, if you like, in what we like to think is the civilized world, are now beginning to learn the heavy lessons of where we can no longer continue to act as we always have. From Bedouin, we can learn about non-consumerism, about leaving no marks behind, only footprints, of doing no harm to each other. Bedouin are extremely loving, and this is something that comes, I believe, from not just their culture, but also living closely with nature. And therefore, their sustainable way of life is something that we definitely can learn from and should respect. And I think that when we talk about indigenous rights, we should perhaps check ourselves and stop and think about whether it's we who give them their rights, or whether by not being able to claim those rights, we are paying a higher price. Because these really are, in many ways, and I'm not being over romantic, I hope, these are the people who should be the guardians of the planet, who understand it, who many, many years ago were warning about this, the rising sea level, because they saw it happening, who understand the weather from the stars, who see the moon in all its glory that we never see, because we only ever see, unless you're living in desert or out in wilderness, we only ever see a very limited version of the moon. And in desert, of course, it's at least double the size. So I would say that for me, coming to Bedouin culture came as part of that journey that was very much geared to Kabbalah, and therefore the essence of Judaism, which is very much lost in today's Israel. Again, in my opinion, and I'm happy to, go into this further one-on-one at whenever is opportune. Because in Kabbalah, you learn to isolate the ego and to get into superego and to be able to see where you are going, what you are choosing, and whether your robots are automatic or whether you're free. Whether you are free to make choices, whether you are free, and Bedouins certainly are, they are totally in nowness, whether you are free to be more loving, whether your empathy and your compassion is the essence of your spiritual values. And today's Judaism, as is practiced by the settlers, for example, and I was in an argument this week in the Supreme Court, outside the High Court, with the whole group of Im Tirtzu, whom some of you probably know of, and they are extraordinarily nationalistic. It's very much about ego, mine, ours. They do not see the other. They do not feel the need to open their heart and share. And, you can talk about King Solomon and the sharing of the baby. That is, for me, one of the big lessons that they are missing. But I also believe that probably because of the Holocaust, the Jewish people, and I'm half Jewish, I'm blessed, I'm an Anglican, but I'm also the daughter of somebody who was Haredi and whose grandfather was on the British Board of Deputies and all of that, which I think perhaps gives one a better objective, maybe, I don't know. But certainly the fact that the golden calf is being worshipped and that Israelis are very good at taking but not very good at giving is maybe part of the trauma of history or part of the loss of spiritual leaders, and perhaps even coming back to the Holy Land was expecting too much of people to be able to let go. I don't know about you, I'm not good at letting go. It's one of my biggest challenges. Not to want the last word, not to judge, not to expect, and to allow. All of these things are very much part of indigenous culture, because when you know that your society has to be dependent on others because it's living in extremes. So even though you're alone most of the time, if something happens, you will need somebody, whether they're from another tribe or another culture completely. And therefore, part of their culture is an open heart. It's much easier in desert. People, when you pass in desert, the eye contact is maybe 10 times as long as in a city or in a town or a village, especially once everybody has relaxed. And, the first couple of days of new tourists, they are always very noisy and problematic. And after a while, they calm down. And desert has that magic. I don't know about you, but when I first was in desert, I was scared of it. I thought that it were going to be snakes. I thought that maybe there's strange men walking around. And actually it exudes a very strong vibe of love, as far as I'm concerned, with some amazing, amazing, wonderful memories. You know, waking at 4 a.m. with a desert fox sniffing your face. It doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't happen every month, and it probably never happen again. So Bedouin have an open heart as part of their culture. Israel denies the Bedouin their indigenous status, doesn't want to know. No, you were not here before. They're nomads. They don't own land. It's not true. They're semi-nomadic landowners, pastoral herders, with all of those rights that should be recognized and which Israel is very determined not to. And in fact, there's an Oxford professor, Dawn Chatty, who when she was here referred to cultural genocide. And you can say the same for Druze culture, Palestinian mainstream culture, anything that is not this very weird version of Jewish culture, which I don't think is sustainable. And I want to read you just very briefly one paragraph. Sarah, am I okay on time? Yep, I'm rambling on
Yes, I
here.
believe so.
Good,
Yeah.
okay. So this was written as part of a PhD thesis by a friend of mine who set up the Norwegian Refugee Council office here, NRC. She since died of melanoma. She was an Australian. And this paragraph really stands out to me. She said, Kirsten Zad, in my human rights ontological research for my PhD, I have identified biological markers, drivers, that determine a community's success or otherwise. I propose that they underpin human rights in both theory and practice. They are a strong sense of personal autonomy, tempered by a strong commitment to cooperation, reciprocity, fairness, empathy, and generosity. Communities that implement these innate biological drivers through an equally strong sense of individual responsibility and ongoing social sanctioning, i.e. robust accountability measures, thrive. Communities that do not simply die out in the interests of the survival of the species more broadly, which really, for me, crystallizes this thing of how we are all connected, we need each other, we learn from each other, yet we are independent and free. And I think that if we are solving problems, that whilst anger and judgmentalism, revenge, frustration, all of those are very natural, conflict resolution actually has principles of a greater level of empathy. And that for me is the challenge at the moment, because we can learn all of this body of wisdom from wiser souls, such as many of the more traditional Bedouin. But how do we get Israel to deliver on human rights? How do we get the Israeli public to want a future that is sustainable, that is calm, that is normal, that is a good life, that fulfills the basic principles of Judaism, never mind Kabbalah, and that is in tune with the climate, because we all now have to change. It's comfortable to be able to say they are destroying the planet or they are unsustainable, but I don't think any of us is probably doing as much as we could. I'm not going to say should, because that's judgmental as well. But coming back to Bedouin, in terms of non-consumerism, for example, they do not want more. They do not need to explore. They do not need to develop. They do not want to travel and grab. And if I look at what the average settlers, the ideological settlers, not necessarily those on subsidies, who have been enticed to live across the Green Line. What most of them want is all of it. They do not want to share their toys. They do not even want to acknowledge that the other has rights. And they certainly don't see themselves as equal. And therefore, there is a level of supremacy in that thinking that is really tragic, because it's not going to be able to deliver a reasonable state if you look ahead in 20 years, 30 years' time. At the moment, Israel is busy shooting itself in the foot, losing all friends in any real way. It may have realpolitik, it may have the ability to, command subservience, or a police force that can, with no accountability, get away with everything, etc. But the question then is, what sort of society is that developing? If we go back to Bedouin, they are extraordinarily loving, as I said, very patient, tolerant. They will give you chance after chance after chance. Silent. They're calm. They live very much in nowness, and therefore when they cook, for example, it's never exactly the same, because they are very alive and yet very simple with it. So they're not making a big deal out of any of that. On the contrary, many of the most intelligent are the most simple. I'm looking here for spokespersons, and the answer we're getting is the really wise heads don't want to be involved in all of that. Let me just quickly look through my notes here. So my list is really freedom, truth, the heart, nature, God, giving, non-consumerist, thinking of the other, do not do to others what you don't want done to you, is supposed to be one of the core values of Judaism. Hospitality, it's absolutely traditional. I went a few years ago to hear, those of you in Canada may have heard of a guru called John de Ruyter, and he may be very brilliant. I went from here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to Netanya to meet with him, just to ask him to take on board the occupation and the sickness that it engenders in everybody. And if I tell you that I came home at midnight, having met with him and spoken with him at 9 o'clock, because he was busy until then, I didn't have anybody offer me a glass of water from the time I left home to the time I came back. And I thought how very different that is to Bedouin, who would have been extraordinarily hospitable, made sure you had tea immediately, coffee after that. For 3 days, you can stay with nobody asking questions as to who your name is, what your name is, sorry, who you are, where you're going. And those are all traditions that function, that actually are the basis of a sustainable culture. So Israel, for me, has got very lost in real estate because they really do think in terms of the land and not the life in that land. So I believe it's comparable to the golden calf. Who am I to say that it's the same? We lost our leaders. I think that many did not want peace because they don't value it. And I hope that this community, amongst others, is therefore able to take on board the need to outreach, on the one hand, obviously with compassion to Palestinians, especially, I would say, indigenous peoples who have been completely decultured. As I said earlier, cultural genocide is appropriate as language, but also for the average Israeli who is just, I think, very lost and not able to get to redemption. I may be wrong, and I'm happy to discuss that further. Sarah, is that 20 minutes or so?
You still have 5 to 10 minutes left if you would like to continue speaking, or there's, some questions coming in. It's up to you, Angela.
I would actually like to open it up, because I'm sure that some of what I've said is probably bullshit, and some of you may have interesting follow on and maybe even take over. But I'm here, and I hope there's a community we can do something with some of these ideas. Does anybody do yoga? Yoga is all part of this, because it's actually the exercises on the one hand work on the body in order to, and I don't do yoga, by the way, so I'm totally bullshitting here, but it focuses the body, but it also allows the mind to hold thoughts so that you can get behind. So that is very much part of a spiritual practice that leads hopefully to a greater ability to choose love.
Thank you so much, Angela. I feel like, this morning is something you've shared with us that really, helps us learn about the Bedouin, but also really makes us reflect on our own lives and how are we treating people. And I really appreciate that. We have a few questions here, which I will read out to you if that is okay. One of the first questions that came up was interest in whether, do Palestinians meet the definition of indigenous, and or like the broader Palestinian people versus the Bedouin. So it says, years ago when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, I asked Jennifer Preston, the Canadian Quaker who was involved in developing it, whether the Palestinians were indigenous in the sense of the declaration. She said she wasn't sure, but surely the Bedouin are. This is the person asking the question would think so. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, my comment on that is only what I've ever read or heard, and that is that, yes, the Palestinians are an indigenous people in this region, but they're not claiming it at the, I don't know, World Indigenous Forum or whatever it is. And I would say as a culture, obviously it's very different to Bedouin, which is pastoral herding. I put 2 short films in the chat earlier that I think Ryan has, and that's really about how the future of agriculture in the world has to get back to pastoral herding, because with climate changing, farmers can no longer assume the seasons will be when they're supposed to be, or the rain will be, or there won't be fire. Whereas pastoral herding, those herders are sensitive to the changes and very flexible, and therefore that in this short film that I've shared with Ryan could well be the way that we will have to go forward. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And that even makes me think about, whole definitions of land and how we relate to land and land ownership, and right. So
yep. And also, if you go to indigenous Native Americans, we talk about how can you own the sky or the land or the rain or clouds. We tend to be, for whatever reasons, and I think that's very interesting research area, we tend to be insecure and want to hold on to things. And again, it's this thing of letting go, let it be. We are temporary, we are custodians. It has its nature, its strength, its logic, its wisdom. I don't know what everybody on this Zoom thinks as a definition of God, but for me, certainly, all my life, God has been very close to nature and the laws of nature and the universe, and, not so much a little old man in the sky, but the magic of life. Maybe the magic of death, why would it not also be even more amazing? But again, then we come back to this thing of always wanting more. It's more than we can appreciate. Heaven help us. We are blessed, I think. I hope everybody feels this, because it certainly makes life that much more worth living, to be able to appreciate the blessings of life and the pain of loss, obviously, when dearly loved ones pass. And whatever, let's not even get into what death means. I mean, light, stars, who knows? Okay, next question.
Thank you, Angela. And the next question was, how big is the Jahlin tribe?
Oh, okay. So nobody quite knows. There are in Area C something like 30,000 Bedouin. And of those, there are about 4 tribes. So the Jahlin, I know 1 or 2 who are very, I mean, one guy, he lived in Florida for 20 years, okay? So he's not living in Area C, he's living in a big villa in Betunia, God bless him. I think that there are still some Bedouin Jahlin down in the Negev, but mainly they were forced out in the early 1950s. So again, I would say that many of them are no longer traditional Bedouin of the culture that we were talking about. I mean, there is, if you take away people's land, you take away their ability to sustain themselves, you push them into places like next to a garbage dump or next to a sewage farm, you don't allow them to take their animals out. Before you know it, you've managed successfully to create a criminal thread in your society. People who are alienated naturally, and wouldn't you be? And for whom the desert is very beloved, but they're not allowed to be there. We do not see them as being the people that can teach us how to live in desert. And yet this is one of the world's worst water restricted regions, if not the worst. I think Israel is second in the world as to water access, after only Qatar. So yeah, there are smugglers, there are liars, there are thieves, there are people for whom being Bedouin is no longer an honorable code. And that is something that, you know, Israel has engendered, presumably ignorantly and without thinking it through. And I hope that in the future this will change for everybody's benefit and welfare.
That actually relates to a follow-up question, I think, where someone was asking about they had seen many reports in Haaretz about Bedouin in the Sinai engaging in drug and woman trafficking. And we're wondering if you know anything about that or how you would respond to that.
Yeah, and there is one tribe that is involved in sex trafficking, and it's absolutely horrendous. And I can only say that other Bedouin of other tribes are equally outraged. It's not happening as much these days since Israel built the wall. There is much less sex trafficking coming into Israel through that, what was then a porous border. But again, obviously all societies are not everybody on the same page. You have some that are really brilliant and others who are idiots. You have people, each of whom has his own journey of lessons to learn. And therefore, again, to be super judgmental, maybe overlooking where they are, where they were, where they will be, and who the heck you are.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Another question was asking whether you could connect Indigenous rights to the doctrine of discovery. Have you heard of the doctrine of discovery?
No.
Okay.
Tell
so
me
maybe,
about it.
Yeah. So the doctrine of discovery is a Christian doctrine that basically, like, if you know, as a Western Christian came to a land, you could like claim it on behalf of God, and therefore it belonged, God was like giving it to you. And really, the Indigenous people who were there were considered, you know, lesser than, and not having, Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, that's this whole thing of colonialism. And I speak as somebody whose father was a doctor in Africa since I was 6. And even though it was in the days when colonialism was tailing off, Kenya, Uganda, Swaziland. Nevertheless, there was this very strong expat ethos that was very similar. You know, the white expats considered themselves way ahead, and even my father, I would say, was considerably racist towards his patients, who were mostly Black, and definitely, even when I came here, he wasn't happy that I was coming here to study with somebody Yemenite, because a doctor told him the Yemenites are primitive. We had to teach them how to use toilets. Well, I have news for my late father, that is that Oriental toilets are actually way more hygienic, you know, and they can't understand what the heck we're doing, going around smearing ourselves with toilet paper. But that's another whole thing. So discovery, yeah, I mean, and again, it's this thing of wanting to own, of needing to conquer. I was once on various occasions on Mount Sinai. I lived in the foothills of Mount Sinai for 6 months. And it's a very, very magical mountain, not because necessarily of the history, but for example, if you sit quietly, you hear the monks chanting coming around the back of the mountain in an echo that is really unreal, you know, surreal almost, and all sorts of things like that. So the first time I was on the mountain, I just had a major operation. I'd had my gallbladder out, and I was with people who went to the top, but I figured if I go with them, maybe they'll end up having to carry me down. And that was a huge lesson. And what's this whole thing about needing to get to the top? What is conquering all about? What is the challenge of being the best? I was on the mountain. It's an amazing mountain. It's enough. It was amazing. It's so beautiful. The light, the history of it, where, you know, remember pilgrims used to spend 2 weeks going up the stairs on their knees, their bloody knees, as penance. It's a very, very majestic environment and very blessed. So one was privileged to be even halfway up. Anyway.
Thank you so much for those images. Another question was asking about the patriarchs, and that they were like the Bedouin and lived like the Bedouin. So yeah. How are they viewed in current Israel? And are they sometimes seen as a role model? And how does that relate to, you know, Israeli views of the Bedouin?
Wonderful question and very timely. I don't know if you saw, but there is a petition calling on Fisher-Price to recolor the nativity figurines as people of color, because Jesus and his family were not white. And the issue of the Bedouin, I may need you to refocus me on the question in a moment, because I think I'm losing it. Israelis look at the Bedouin as primitive, as non-existent. They are not interested. And if they are, some of the kibbutzim, for example, are supportive, and yet they are the ones who own Bedouin land, or who are now living on Bedouin land. And I mean, I've been in a home of somebody whose shack looks out, this is down in the Negev, the Nakab Desert. His shack looks out onto his land, where Indian Jews, the cochineal Jews are living. And he used to have to work there as the only means of subsistence he had, working in their greenhouses as a cheap laborer. And then they stopped doing any agriculture. They went into high tech, and he had to watch the greenhouses completely disintegrate. So Israelis going down to Eilat, they will pass all these shacks, or indeed Christian pilgrims in the 1800s. They don't see them. The Christian pilgrims in the early days, they only recognized villages if they had roofs with you know, tiles and tents. For them, that wasn't visible. So I would say now Mansour Abbas coming into the government has raised the profile somewhat. But am I right in thinking the question was, how do Israelis see Bedouin?
And relating specifically to the patriarchs of the Torah,
Yeah.
So like Abraham,
thank you.
Isaac,
That was the bit. So we have a project called Ibrahim's Tent, where we have reintroduced traditional goat's hair tent making for women, Bedouin refugees, so that they have a sustainable income. And I mean, it's problematic because the nature of development these days is that people have become dependent, and therefore the women say, oh, don't you have money? We don't really want to work. We'd rather just you give us the money like before, or like others do. But we called it Ibrahim's tent because Abraham is the shared forefather. And that patriarch, Israel is Judaizing, as the Abraham Accords, for example. And people are forgetting or not signing on to what to you or me is pretty obvious, which is it's the same forefather, just as the same God. And it's this enormous possessiveness that, no, they do not want to see Bedouin out there grazing, even though Abraham's sons were grazing sheep and were therefore probably Bedouin. And it's, again, maybe in time this will change. Maybe it's not as relevant as I think it is, but I do find the average Israeli, which is a difficult thing to talk about, but the average Israeli thinks in terms of Brooklyn or London or Paris and is not interested in deep connection. On the contrary, our buildings, our use of water, our amount of, I mean, they're even now planning a new city near Ma'ale Adumim, Givat Adumim. The way we are killing the land that we are said to love, we're loving it to death. And only now is the Israeli public beginning to understand that climate change demands change. You're mute. Sarah?
Thank you. And I think Ryan posted a link to be able to see a video and to look at the tents as well. I think we have time for one more question before we move to our action time. And they're wondering if you can provide an update on the current displacement of the Bedouin, especially in E1. Israel tried hard to remove them from Khan al-Ahmar, but was stopped by pressure from the international community. Then there was news that they would be displaced in July, but it hasn't happened. What's the latest news, please?
Okay, so that was a bit of misinformation about July, because in July there was supposed to be the state response delivered to the other side in the High Court case of Regavim. That has been postponed. The state asked for more time, and I don't remember if it's September or October. But E1, we were supposed to be yesterday in Beit El for the objections to the E1 plan, and that has been postponed until October as well. So the pressure is working. So far, there has been enormous pressure. The ICC also has ruled for jurisdiction, and the Bedouin case, Al-Khan al-Ahmar, is in front of them as observations. Their lawyer, and we were involved in doing translations over the phone with Bedouin and her. So she submitted observations to the ICC so that their case is part of what is under consideration. Nobody has been forcibly displaced en masse, but obviously there are daily demolitions going on. When I say nobody has been, I'm forgetting actually in the north of the Jordan Valley that there is a village there that has been many times now demolished. And therefore, I'm saying to diplomats, I know we have pressure. Is it enough? And the answer I got from one American diplomat was, it's a lot. Well, it's obviously not enough to change policy. So it needs to be much, much more. And I think that we are delivering now. We're starting to begin to have the systems that can deliver that. For example, there are 200 Zoom briefings going on this week and last week of Palestinian voices to members of Congress or to their aides, which is encouraging. Obviously, the Congress has been split, where before it tended to be bipartisan support of Israel. You now have progressive voices challenging this. And I think that this is something we just need to take as the baseline to build on, because I think it is delivering some change. But as I said, with Burns here today, William Burns, the head of the CIA, the demolition this morning was probably a message to him. And that sort of behavior is not going to end easily. But yeah, more pressure.
Thank you so much, Angela, for everything you shared with us. And again, I just hear that encouragement to keep the pressure on. You know, we've been doing so much, but we need to do more. And I think that's a really good reminder.
Can I just add one thing, and that is to thank all of these people here. You are amazing. I mean, I'm looking and I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names. And you guys really, I don't know if you understand what an amazing army you are. God bless you. It's in your hands. And thank you. Okay.
All right. So we now will do our action. As we know, this Kumi now, it's about learning and taking that learning into action, into the world. And today we're going to take some time to look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to share this important document with others. So we'll post some instructions on the screen and give you 5 minutes to get started on doing this action here right now. Just a reminder, you'll have to get all the links from the chat. You won't be able to copy it from the screen share itself. And I'll just share a little bit about how this relates. So from the UN website, they said the 2021 theme of International Day of Indigenous Peoples is leaving no one behind, Indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract. A social contract is an unwritten agreement that societies make to cooperate for social and economic benefits. In many countries where Indigenous peoples were driven from their lands, their cultures and languages denigrated, and their people marginalized from political and economic activities, they were never included in the social contract to begin with. So over recent years and decades, various societies have sought to address this, including through apologies, truth and reconciliation efforts, legislative reforms, as well as constitutional reforms. And at the international level, this has included adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I know many countries around the world are adopting the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as part of their own constitutional law. Canada just did this in June of this year. And it's a good basing point, right, then to then advocate on legal grounds for the rights of Indigenous peoples. So we'll put on some music while you do this action and then come back in a few minutes to finish up. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again to Angela as well. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so, and we'll share it in our next newsletter. Remember that you can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. Please share this session with your friends and colleagues and invite them to our future sessions. It's really such a good way to stay in touch with what is going on and what we can do. We hope you will join us next week, where we will focus on the role of the United States, what its current role is, and our hopes for what it can be and should be in Palestine. If you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. We hope to see you all back here in a week's time. Thanks again, and good night.